You're down to your last piece of bread. Your children are hungry. You have no money, no hope, and winter is closing in around you. Then a stranger appears at your door, asking for shelter. What would you do? The Anderson family made a choice that night that seemed foolish, even dangerous. They gave away their last meal to a complete stranger. What they received in return was so miraculous, so life-changing, that their story became legend. This is that story, and it will restore your faith in the impossible. In the remote countryside of northern Minnesota, surrounded by endless pine forests and frozen lakes, lived Thomas and Margaret Anderson in a small wooden cabin with their 3 children. The harsh winter had been unforgiving, and the family had fallen on the hardest times they had ever known. Thomas had once been the area's most skilled carpenter. His hands could craft beautiful furniture from the roughest timber, and families would travel for miles to commission his work. But the economic downturn had changed everything. People could no longer afford handcrafted furniture when factory-made pieces cost so much less. "Mama, I'm hungry," whispered little Emma, tugging at her mother's worn dress. Margaret's eyes filled with tears as she looked into her 7-year-old daughter's pale face. In the small kitchen cupboard, there was only half a loaf of stale bread, their last bit of food. The twins, Michael and Sarah, sat quietly by the fireplace, too young to fully understand their situation, but old enough to sense their parents' worry. "Children," Thomas said softly, his weather hands trembling slightly, "I need to go into town tomorrow. Maybe someone needs some repair work done." But Margaret knew, as did Thomas, that it had already tried everywhere in the small town of Pine Valley. No one had work to offer, and no one had money to spare. As the snow continued to fall outside their frost-covered windows, the family gathered around their meager dinner, thin soup made from the last vegetables in their root cellar, shared among 5 people. Just as darkness was settling over the forest, there came a gentle knock at their door. Thomas and Margaret exchanged worried glances. Who will be traveling on such a bitter night? Thomas opened the heavy wooden door to find an elderly man standing in the snow. The stranger was tall but bent with age, wearing a simple gray coat that seemed inadequate for freezing weather. His white beard was dusted with snowflakes, and his kind eyes seemed to hold depths of wisdom and compassion. "Good evening," the stranger said, his voice warm despite the cold. "I'm sorry to disturb you so late, but I've been traveling and lost my way in the storm. Might I shelter here for the night? I don't ask for much, just a warm place to rest." Margaret's heart immediately went out to the old man, but she looked anxiously at Thomas. They had so little themselves. How could they share what they didn't have? Thomas, despite their desperate situation, couldn't turn away someone in need. "Of course, sir. Please, come in from the cold." The stranger stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat. The children gathered around, curious about their unexpected guest. Emma, despite her hunger, smiled shyly at the kind-faced old man. "You have a beautiful family," the stranger said, his eyes twinkling as he looked at the children. "Thank you," Margaret replied, feeling embarrassed about their humble home and their obvious poverty. "I'm afraid we don't have much to offer you for supper." "Nonsense," the stranger said gently. "Whatever you can share will be more than enough. The greatest gift is the warmth of a generous heart." Margaret's cheeks flushed as she looked at their meager evening meal. The thin soup was nearly gone, and there was only that half loaf of stale bread remaining, bread she had been saving for the children's breakfast. But looking at the stranger's kind face, and remembering how her own grandmother had always said that no guest should leave their home hungry, she made her decision. "Children," she said softly, "let's set another place at the table." She cut the remaining bread into 6 thin slices instead of 5, making her own portion even smaller. The stranger noticed the sacrifice but said nothing, simply bowing his head in gratitude. As they ate, the stranger told wonderful stories of distant places and times long past. The children forgot their hunger as they listened, enchanted by tales of brave knights, wise queens, and magical forests. Even Thomas and Margaret found themselves smiling and laughing for the first time in months. "You know," the stranger said, looking directly at Thomas, "I once knew a carpenter whose work was so beautiful that angels themselves would weep at its craftsmanship." Thomas looked up, surprised. "I used to be a carpenter, sir. Not a very successful one, it seems. Success, the stranger said mysteriously, is not always measured the way we think. When morning came, the family woke to find the stranger already dressed and ready to continue his journey. The storm had passed, leaving the world covered in pristine white snow that sparkled like diamonds in the early sunlight. "Thank you," the stranger said, clasping Thomas's hand warmly. "Your kindness last night meant more to me than you could imagine. I have traveled far and wide, and rarely have I encountered such generous hearts." He reached into his worn travel bag and pulled out what appeared to be an ordinary wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with intricate but simple carvings on its lid. "I have little to offer in return," he said, handing the box to Margaret, "but please accept this small gift as a token of my gratitude." Margaret took the box hesitantly. It was surprisingly light, and when she shook it gently, it made no sound at all. What is it?" she asked. The stranger smiled mysteriously. "Open it when you need it most. But remember, share whatever blessing you receive, as you share with me." With those words, he shouldered his small bag and walked out into the morning snow. The family watched from their doorway as his figure grew smaller and smaller, until he disappeared entirely into the forest. "Strange old fellow," Thomas murmured, but there was something about the encounter that felt different, special, somehow. For the rest of that day, Margaret kept looking at the wooden box. Several times she almost opened it, but something held her back. What could an old traveler possibly have that would help their desperate situation? By evening, their situation had become truly dire. They had eaten the last scraps of food in the house, and the children were asking for dinner with hopeful eyes that broke their parent hearts. "Thomas," Margaret whispered, I think we need to open the box." With trembling hands, she lifted the carved lid. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, were 5 gleaming gold coins, more money than the family had seen in years. Thomas stared in disbelief. That's impossible. The box was so light. But there they were, real and solid. Margaret picked one up, and it was definitely genuine gold, warm and heavy in her palm. "Mama, what is it?" Emma asked, seeing her parents' amazed expressions. It's help, sweetheart," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It's help." True to the stranger's words, Thomas and Margaret didn't keep the blessing to themselves. The next morning, Thomas went to the general store and bought food, not just for his own family, but extra to share with other struggling families in the area. But something even more remarkable happened. Word spread quickly about Thomas's newfound ability to help others, and people began coming to him with small carpentry jobs. It was as if the community suddenly remembered the skill and craftsmanship he possessed. "It's the strangest thing," said Mrs. Johnson, the storekeeper's wife. "I've been meaning to have that broken chair fixed for months, but I just kept forgetting. This morning I woke up thinking about Thomas Anderson and how handy he is with wood." Within a week, Thomas had more work than he could handle. People were commissioning furniture, asking for repairs, and even requesting decorative pieces. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing all the opportunities that had been held back. 3 months later, as spring began to melt the winter snow, the Anderson family had been completely transformed. Their home was warm and comfortable. The children were healthy and well-fed, and Thomas's carpentry business was thriving like never before. But more than their material circumstances had changed. The family had developed a reputation throughout the region for their generosity and kindness. No one in need was ever turned away from their door, and Margaret had started a community soup kitchen in the church basement. One evening, as the family sat around their dinner table, now laden with plenty of food, Emma looked up at her parents with bright, curious eyes. "Mama, Papa," she said, "do you think that old man was an angel?" Thomas and Margaret exchanged meaningful looks. They had been wondering the same thing for months. "I don't know, sweetheart," Margaret replied softly. "But I know that sometimes, when we're willing to share what little we have, miracles can happen." "Your mother's right," Thomas added, reaching across the table to squeeze his wife's hand. That night, we had almost nothing left, but we shared it anyway, because it was the right thing to do. And look what happened. Young Michael, now 8 and much healthier than he'd been that terrible winter, piped up, "So if we're good people, good things happen to us?" "It's not that simple," Thomas said carefully. "We should be kind because it's right, not because we expect rewards. But yes, I believe that kindness creates more kindness in the world." Years passed, and the Anderson family story became legendary in the small communities of northern Minnesota. Thomas's craftsmanship became renowned throughout the state, and Margaret's Soup Kitchen had grown into a full community center that helped families in need. Emma, now a young woman, had become a teacher and often told her students the story of the mysterious stranger who had changed their lives. The wooden box sat in a place of honor on the family's mantelpiece, a constant reminder of that miraculous night. One day, an elderly pastor from a neighboring town came to visit the community center. As he was touring the facilities, he stopped suddenly in front of a painting that Emma had made years earlier, a painting of the mysterious stranger from that snowy night. "My dear child," the pastor said, his voice filled with awe, "where did you see this man?" Emma told him the story, and the pastor's eyes filled with tears. "In all my years of studying Scripture and traveling to holy places," he said quietly, "I have heard many accounts of such encounters. There are those who believe that in our darkest hours, when we show true compassion despite our own suffering, we may be blessed with divine visitors." He paused, looking again at the painting with reverence. "The man you described, the circumstances of his appearance, the nature of his gift, and especially his words about sharing blessings, these are consistent with accounts of Kaid, known in English as the Green One, a righteous servant God who appears to help those who help others." Margaret, now gray-haired but still strong, felt a deep peace settle over her heart. "We never knew his name," she said softly, "but we knew he was special." "Names matter less than hearts," the pastor replied. "What matters is that you recognize a fellow human being in need, and you respond with love despite your own desperate circumstances. That kind of faith and compassion is what opens the door to miracles." As the years continued to pass, the Anderson family story spread far beyond their small community. Margaret and Thomas, now grandparents, had created a legacy of generosity that touched hundreds of lives. The soup kitchen had evolved into a full social services center, providing job training, childcare, and emergency assistance to families throughout the region. Thomas's carpentry workshop had become a training center where he taught young people the skills they needed to support themselves. But perhaps most importantly, they had passed on to their children and grandchildren the lesson they had learned that snowy night. That sometimes our greatest blessings come not from what we receive, but from what we're willing to give, even when we have so little ourselves. Emma, now married with children of her own, made sure to tell them the story every year on the anniversary of the stranger's visit. And every winter, when the snow fell deep and the wind howled to the pine trees, the Anderson family would prepare extra food and keep their door ready to welcome anyone who might need shelter from the storm. You never know. Margaret would tell her grandchildren, her eyes twinkling with memory and faith, when you might be entertaining an angel. And indeed, over the years, many travelers found warmth and welcome at their door. None seemed quite as mysterious as that first visitor, but each was treated with the same generosity and love, because the Andersons had learned that every person who comes to us in need might be carrying a divine message, if only we have eyes to see and hearts willing to share. The wooden box remained on the mantelpiece, now empty but still treasured. For the family had learned that the greatest gifts are not the ones we keep, but the ones we give away, and that sometimes, in the act of giving, we receive far more than we could ever have imagined. Epilogue, the continuing circle. Today, in the small town of Pine Valley, Minnesota, there stands a beautiful community center with these words carved and wood above its entrance. Share whatever blessing you receive, as you have been blessed. Visitors often ask about the unusual inscription, and the locals are always happy to tell them the story of the Anderson family and the mysterious stranger who came to them on a snowy winter night so many years ago. Some say it's just a legend, a story that grew in the telling. But the older residents remember Margaret and Thomas Anderson, remember their kindness, and remember the mysterious transformation of their fortunes after that night. And every winter, when the snow falls deep and the wind is fierce, there are still families in northern Minnesota who keep their doors ready to welcome strangers, because they know that sometimes, Angels travel on the coldest nights, and miracles come to those who are willing to share their last piece of bread with a fellow human being in need. The story reminds us all that in our darkest hours, when we choose love over fear, generosity over selfishness, we open ourselves to possibilities we never could have imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, we might find that we have been blessed by a divine visitor who saw in our hearts something worthy of a miracle.